have to ascertain what is the risk and what is the potential downside loss of that. And so I understand what the economic downside is, but I think we need some numbers of kind of where we are in this process.
The gentleman from California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to associate myself with your statements, particularly those dealing with the mortgage foreclosure prevention and the use of TARP funds to achieve that goal. Earlier in our discussion, there was discussion of the intent of the Secretary of the Treasury and the intent of members of Congress being balanced in interpreting this law. I want to point out that under the Constitution, Congress writes the law, and legislative intent is the only intent that should govern the construction of a statute. I have a question for the record that I hope all three of you would respond to, and that is whether you'll use your influence over banks to remind them of how important it is to lend to credit-worthy projects being done by charitable organizations. The work of charities is very important during this recession, and all too often banks refuse to lend or refuse to provide letters of credit to charitable projects because they're concerned about the bad public relations that they would have if they ever had to foreclose. I think it's important that they get some bad public relations for refusing to lend and some pressure from the you folks in achieving that objective. Secretary Paulson, I want to commend you for buying preferred stock rather than toxic assets. First, your approach ensures that we're only bailing out U.S. institutions and not buying toxic assets that were in safes in Beijing on September 20th. Second, you're buying a much more valuable asset. Any ninth grader would tell you, any 9-year-old would tell you that a toxic asset is less valuable than preferred stock. But I can't commend you on accepting half the rate of return and 1/6 the number of warrants than Warren Buffett was able to get on similar transactions. Our children will have a larger national debt because we have been so generous in the terms on the preferred stock. I would also point out that, Mr. Secretary, this would bother me a lot, except I wasn't in favor of buying toxic assets. But you've basically testified here that October 3rd, you had already decided to change your mind and not buy toxic assets and instead buy preferred stock. And you didn't tell Congress immediately before our vote that you would be going in a different direction. Perhaps I've misinterpreted your comments, and if I have, I'm sure the record will reflect that. And if you hadn't made that decision until after our vote on October 3rd, and I gather from your facial expression that's what you're meaning to say.
Absolutely.
Then thank you. Let me move on.
This was a
sir, let me move on. I'll accept.
And very seriously difficult situation.
Mr. Paulson, the members control the time. It's just there's no debate.
Then I did misinterpret your comments, and if you made the decision after October 3rd, I fully understand. Now, under Section 111 of the bill, you're supposed to put forward regulations limiting executive compensation to that which is appropriate. You've been remarkably liberal in that you have only imposed by regulations the minimum standards set forth in the statute, and you therefore allow unlimited regular salaries, unlimited bonuses to be declared by boards of directors. But while you've been so liberal in defining that part of the bill, another part of the bill requires you to define financial institutions eligible for participation under TARP. In fact, the statute explicitly says that insurance companies are eligible, and yet the CPP has issued regulations saying that only depository institutions are eligible. The insurance companies have to go out and buy depository institutions, as noted on the first page of today's Wall Street Journal. But the issue that I'd like you to address orally is bailing out or providing some sustenance to the automobile companies. We know how important that is to the economy. If you got rid of your CPP regulations and looked at the statute, you would see that auto companies do qualify since they are incorporated under the United States and they are regulated by the United States and its state governments. But instead, your definitions in the CPP regulations limit you to just depository institutions. So the question I have for you, Mr. Secretary, is if the bill, as properly interpreted, allows you to buy preferred stock from the three major auto companies, would you at least buy enough preferred stock to tide them over until the new administration could make a policy decision? Or do you think it's
The gentleman
acceptable
wants an answer. We're going to have to wrap that up now.
to have the Obama administration just look at 3 companies in Chapter 7?
I've answered this a couple times, so I'll answer it again. And I think it is very, very important to stay with the purpose of the TARP, because this is all about protecting the financial system, avoiding collapse and recovery. And there is a good deal more that needs to be done before this system is recovered, market is functioning as normal, credit is flowing, and that will make a big difference. Now, with regard to the auto companies, what we've said, and I think you've heard me say it, the Congress has acted. You have a bill that was passed, $25 billion bill, Department of Energy, and again, I urge you to modify that to have a path for making an investment in a viable company.
Sir.
The gentleman from Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the panelists for their attendance here this morning and their oftentimes responsiveness. I want to follow up a bit on the insurance companies purchasing banks issue. We learned over the past couple of days that that is indeed occurring, and I would ask you, Mr. Secretary, whether you believe that is appropriate or consistent with the mission of the program.
The mission of the program is focused on banks and bank holding companies and getting capital into the system. We don't have capability at the federal level looking at insurance. And so what we're going to do is applications, if applications...
I understand what the process is, but my question is about, is it appropriate for insurance companies to be forced through the machinations of this program to go out and purchase banks to gain access to this money?
I'm not sure that's going to be a successful strategy. We are going to look only at applications that we think make sense after they're forwarded to us by the regulator. Now, there are a number of insurance companies that already and have been bank holding companies for some time, have been regulated at the federal level for some time, and in my judgment, it may make sense to put capital into those institutions who are playing a vital role in lending and keeping our economy going. But
let me ask a question to move on to some smaller entities. I have many constituents who are members of credit unions and small community banks, and they have real concerns about them being not eligible for participation in the TARP. How are you working to address the concerns of these smaller financial institutions, which are oftentimes the keys to their local communities?
I think they are keys, and I think they will do a lot of lending. And I had said in my opening testimony that we have published regulations yesterday, which have now extended the term sheet for private banks, C Corps. There are thousands of them. We expect to get applications from a number of community banks and banks that are going to be very vital to this economy. And we are expecting regulators to forward many of those applications to us, and we're expecting to put capital into many of them.
Let me, I think the general concern that many of us have voiced on both sides, and that is the federal government picking winners and losers in this process. And there's a general angst up here, as there is across the nation, about a relative lack of confidence in the federal government to be able to get this right. There are some fundamental principles that many of us believe have resulted in the remarkable success of the United States over hundreds of years. I might broaden this to the Chairman as well. What fundamental principles do you believe are consistent with the TARP program?
Okay, I will answer it briefly and then go to Ben. The purpose of the TARP program is, as I said, fundamentally about preserving our system here, keeping it from collapsing and then helping it recover. Now, once you have the government intervene, that is by definition going against many of the principles we've believed in for a long time in terms of markets. We're doing this to preserve our markets. So we have, there are two programs we've outlined to date.